Great Genghis, year of the wolf, dreamed of a Mongol empire stretching throughout all of China. I have sought to realize his dream without spilling Mongol blood. I have been patient. My patience has been rewarded with the severed heads of men who have marched beside you. My scholars, ministers, advise me to choose peace over war. But I am a proud Mongol. At times, peace can only be achieved through cruel war. We begin the expedition to fulfill our destiny. You noble men, willing to die for a cause greater than yourselves, will return not with wealth, nor slaves, but with honor. Those of you who do not return will have your names carved in the secret history of the Mongols. Your wives, children, and parents will hold their heads above other Mongols, because in their hearts, they know their husbands, their fathers, their sons gave their lives in pursuit of the last dream of our great Genghis.
In 1227, Temujin, the son of a chief, dies. Of course, he's not really known by that point as Temujin. He dies known as Genghis Khan, the Great Khan, a true world emperor. When he dies, he leaves a legacy of, well, for one, owning a considerable chunk of the surface of the world, having an empire that stretches from the Caspian all the way to the Pacific. He also leaves a legacy of being one of the cruelest, but also one of the most talented military and political leaders in all of history. The question is going to be, what does it all mean, and was it worth it? Many great empires fail to survive the loss of their founders. The question is Genghis Khan's empire going to be one of those empires? But, for now, fear not. The emperor, the king, may be dead, but he is succeeded by this handsome boy, Ogedei Khan. And before you ask, no, that is not dirt on his face. Ogedei Khan, remember, is not Genghis Khan's eldest son. Instead, he's seen as Genghis Khan's most capable son. Now, Ogedei Khan probably isn't possessed of Genghis Khan's genius for warfare and political intrigue and governance, but he's seen as solid and capable. He fought by his father's side for many years, commanded independently under his father's overall supervision, was seen as good-natured, affable, maybe a little bit of a drunk, but beyond that, he was seen as solid hands to hold this new empire in. But here's the fundamental problem of the Mongolian Empire. The Mongolian Empire was established just as much through politics as through warfare. Remember, Genghis Khan switched Mongols from a tribal system of loyalty to one of personal loyalty to him. Now, the question is going to be, can an empire that's governed by almost a cult of personality survive the death of that personality? And as we're going to find out, the Mongol Empire emerges because it breaks from tribalism, but ultimately it's conquered by tribalism in the decades, if not centuries, after the death of Genghis Khan. After Genghis Khan's death, the empire basically splits into four separate parts that we already sort of mentioned. There is the Golden Horde, there's the Ilkhanate, there's the Chagatai Khanate, and finally the Yuan dynasty. We're actually going to go into each one of them. Now, as we're going to talk about, the practical structure of the Mongolian Empire is that it was more or less a confederacy. If you don't know what a confederacy is, it's basically a system where you have an overall national government, an overall ruler, but each separate piece of the empire or the state essentially functions autonomously. Now, that might be a little bit of a stretch, but the empire of the Mongols was more or less a confederacy at the extreme end, or if we're being generous, it was more of a federation. So, in other words, it's not this strong centralized system like we see in the case of the Chinese Empire. What you're also going to find is that these Mongolian Khanates, these Mongolian empires, really stop being very Mongolian. What kind of happens is that even though the Mongols conquer a considerable chunk of planet Earth by force of arms, the reality is that the cultures and institutions that they conquer end up conquering them. So what you're going to see is, for example, the Ilkhanate basically conquers most of Persia, and eventually the Ilkhanate kind of adopts Persian culture. The forces of Kublai Khan, later called the Yuan dynasty, conquer most of China. This is where like the Song dynasty gets absorbed. And what happens? Well, basically Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty, they become more authentically Chinese. And so the Mongolian Empire really kind of fragments along a number of different axes. It fragments culturally, it fragments politically, and of course, it fragments in the heart of the empire itself. Like we said, it's an empire based around the cult of personality of a single leader, and there's that leader is pretty much dead. So the four Mongol states we're going to talk about is first the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde is basically a part of the Mongolian Empire led by the grandson of Genghis Khan, Batu Khan, and it's basically supposed to be the spearhead for an invasion that will take all of Europe. You have the Ilkhanate, which, spoiler, is eventually the Khanate that will destroy the Abbasid Empire, sack the capital of Baghdad. The Ilkhanate is led by Hulagu, who is also another grandson of Genghis Khan. You have Chagatai Khanate is going to be the least important of the Khanates. Sorry to pick on it. And what we're also going to find is that because it appears right smack dab in the middle of Central Asia, it doesn't really take the form of any particular country that it conquers. And then finally, we have an entire can of worms by itself, the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan. You know, that charming guy you saw in the intro who was talking about war and all that. But spoiler, by the 14th century, so basically the 1300s, Mongol Khanates were no more. So for contestant number one, we have the Chagatai Khan Show. Actually, just kidding. I don't really want to watch the Chagatai Khan show. It's boring and no one likes him anyway. Speaking of boring, the Chagatai Empire was led by Chagatai Khan. It's founded in 1225, and there's a little bit of it that actually lasts until 1687, but it basically spends most of its existence in the geopolitical equivalent of hospice care. Like right out of the gate, practically, less than a century after it's founded, it is mostly conquered by a sort of Mongolian wannabe warlord by the name of Tamerlane or Timur, and we'll actually talk a lot more about him a little bit later. He conquers the western half of the empire, and it becomes increasingly decentralized and becomes sub-khanates. Yay. I said no, no Chagatai Khan show. Just stop it. Now, there's this meme in history, specifically military history, that anytime you invade Russia, especially in winter, you're basically shooting yourself in the foot. And there's lots of evidence that suggests that there's something to this. Well, there's Charles XII, there's Napoleon Bonaparte, there's, of course, Adolf Hitler and the whole World War II thing. So, I mean, we at least have three data points that help confirm this thesis. Oh, well, never mind, because you know who did actually invade Russia in winter? Well, the Mongols did. So, the Mongol faction that conquers large chunks of Eastern Europe is called the Golden Horde. We don't actually know where that name comes from. There's a story that's apocryphal that it was based on the how the sunlight sort of reflected off of the Mongol lamellar armor and shields, but again, your guess is as good as ours. So Ogedei Khan spends a lot of time in the Golden Horde, even though nominally it's led by Batu Khan. So the Mongols come in and they basically kick butt and take names. They successfully conquer the trading hub of Kiev, if you remember our discussion of Kievan Rus. And basically, most of the Rus are conquered, including, by the way, the town of Muscovy, which later becomes Moscow. One of the only cities that actually escapes conquest is Novgorod, led by Prince Alexander Nevsky. But the only reason that Novgorod escapes destruction is basically because Alexander Nevsky pays the Mongols off, and he becomes a tribute-based vassal. The Mongols also had some significant success fighting a group of hardened Crusader knights, specifically the Teutonic Knights and some elements of the Knights Templar. These are sort of the heaviest of all the heavy knights. And how do the Mongols win? Well, if you guessed feigned retreat, you would be correct. They do it again, and it, of course, works for them perfectly. So everything is going well for the Mongols, except there's a problem, and the problem is that Ogedei Khan dies as the conquest of Eastern Europe is going on, and so what do the Mongols have to do? They have to retreat basically to Karakorum and select another leader, except once they do that, it's almost like they lose their momentum, and maybe a kind of ADHD sets in, and they just sort of forget about Eastern Europe. So because of the Mongol conquest, you do see an increase in Eurasian trade because the Mongols are once again protecting the Silk Road. So there's a trade conduit between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. You are seeing the trade of honey, glassware, gunpowder, firearms, spices, not spices, spies. Spies, of course, move along the trade route, gems, textiles, and rugs. I didn't skip over slaves. What I wanted to also mention there is that many of these slaves were actually from cities that resisted. And so the Mongols would capture them and basically turn them into slavery. So what we can kind of say about the Mongol occupation of Eastern Europe is that it was fairly brutal. Not in the, way that it was brutal to the Khwarezm Empire, but still you have high taxes on peasants. And so as a result, because the peasants can't really pay for, their land, their taxes on land, a lot of peasants give up their land and crops to the aristocracy in exchange for protection from Mongols. You might remember that in Eastern Europe, you actually have a much more sort of free environment than what you find in Western Europe around the same time period. That changes with the Mongols because now you have the implantation of serfdom in Eastern Europe, and serfdom stays around, especially in Russia, until the middle of the 19th century. So again, in Russian history, this is also very important because Russia becomes isolated from Western European influences, and arguably this is what gives Russia its very unique character. once again, we see the fact that the Golden Horde, like Genghis Khan himself, wasn't really interested in administering an empire. They enjoyed the idea of having a protection racket. They demanded tribute from their vassals, that kind of thing. So the Mongols forced princes to pay tribute. And Moscow was actually an early collaborator with the Mongols, which is actually something a little awkward about Moscow in Russian history. So, for those of you who don't know, the Russian state eventually forms around the Duchy of Muscovy. So, Kievan Rus is the homeland of Russian culture. Muscovy, is the home of the Russian state. So Moscow's role was to collect tribute for the Golden Horde. And when you couldn't pay, I mean, nowadays, if you can't pay off your mortgage, well, your house gets taken. Well, the same system pretty much applied for territories that couldn't pay Moscow. So Moscow took over those territories for itself. And as a result, Moscow grows in to greater strength. So as Moscow is growing in strength, the Golden Horde is declining, and to a certain extent this kind of makes sense because if you look at the territory the Golden Horde is occupying, it's not really all that economically productive. And so what happens is eventually you have the Battle of Kulikovo where the Russians defeat the Golden Horde, and at that point the balance of power starts shifting to the Russian princes. However, the Golden Horde is still around for a fairly long time, and I believe that Ivan the Terrible fights them as late as, well, we'll get to that a little bit later, but let's just say that they're around for a very long time. So now we move on to contestant number 2. We will all get together and watch the following film. Hulagu, the demon spawn bloodening. Hulagu might not have been demon spawn per se, but a lot of people probably at the time thought that. So Hulagu was the ruler of the Ilkhan Empire, also called the Ilkhanate, and first order of business in 1258 CE, they took one of the largest and most advanced cities on planet Earth, Baghdad. We talked about this already with Dar al-Islam, but remember that they celebrated their success by killing between 200 to 800,000 people. They also captured the Abbasid Caliph and his son. Now, generally, if you killed highborn nobility, like the freaking emperor of the Abbasid Empire, that usually was seen as pretty gauche. Fortunately, Hulagu had a solution to this problem. A solution that didn't involve spilling the blood of highborn people onto the ground. What happens is, of course, Hulagu delicately wraps them in a very luxurious rug, so they're nice, warm, and tight. He wraps both the Caliph and his son in there, so they're comfortable. And then, on a signal, he has hundreds of his cavalry basically trample over the rug and stampede them, well, to death. So there's that. Because of the success of the Ilkhanate against the Abbasid Caliphate, Christians in the West saw the Mongols as potential allies. So you actually have this little sort of cute love letter sent by Pope Innocent IV, to Hulagu asking for some kind of alliance. Hulagu basically replies that, Western Europe would be better off under Mongol rule anyway, and so there's really not that much need of any alliance. It's interesting, Pope Innocent IV doesn't really talk to them again after that. So, at its furthest extent, you have the Ilkhan Empire controlling what is now modern-day Pakistan, all the way through Afghanistan, all the way to the borders of Turkey. So basically Persia, a large chunk of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, which is a considerable chunk of geography. But it could have been even larger. The Mongols also wanted to occupy Egypt, but the Egyptians, led by the Mamelukes, like we've talked about, had other ideas. At the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Mamelukes pull out sort of a rabbit from their hat, if cannons are rabbits. The Mamelukes open fire on the Mongols, and apparently the Mongols are totally unprepared for, the novelty and the terror of cannon fire. So they nope right out of there. Hulagu decides to reconsider his plan to conquer the entire Muslim world. But what's already starting to happen is that even though the goal is to conquer the Muslim world, it seems like the Muslim world is conquering Hulagu and the Ilkhanate. The reason I say that is because Hulagu's cousin Berke, the new Khan of the Golden Horde, well, he converts to Islam. Slowly but surely, all Mongols in the Ilkhanate were converted to Islam as well. So the Ilkhanate destroys Baghdad while it's enjoying this literary and cultural golden age. And so it seems like Islam's fortunes in the Middle East have come to an end. But that's not actually what happens. Like we said, the Ilkhanate actually converts to Islam, and actually they change their legal code to include Islamic principles. So kind of like a combination of secular law and Sharia. The Mongols, like they do with other parts of their empire, they tend to use local elites to administer taxes and census taking and the actual administration of the empire. And like we've also seen with the Mongols, they were generally tolerant of scholars and artisans. Historians, astronomers, mathematicians, all of them thrived under the Ilkhanate scholarship, sponsorship. And of course, Greco-Roman classics are also preserved under the Ilkhanate's rule. So this kind of continues that golden age of Islam. It's just not under the auspices of the Abbasid Caliphate. Now it's under the control of the Ilkhanate. So once again, it's more of a protection racket. The Mongols are extracting taxes and tributes. And of course, there's that Silk Road, that trade route, the trade routes that go through Persia, which of course enriches the Ilkhanate. Now for the big puppy.
I am Kublai Khan, the great Khan. My lands stretch from sunrise to sunset. I reach out my hand, and all men tremble. I ride with the horde at my back. We conquer everything before us. We attack. We conquer. We are fearless and unstoppable.
We will talk about Kublai Khan next time.